So, how many people here have heard of Rails? Everybody here almost? All right. How many people here have used Rails? 3? Okay. So this is the right audience then. One thing that Claudia and I were talking about recently was why is it a pattern that try out Rails and then they just never come back? And so hopefully this will give you an idea of why I like it and why I think that it makes me more productive. So I still like C#, the language. I was sort of disenchanted with sort of Microsoft tools and the direction of Microsoft tools. And so I started looking around, and I had a project on the side that I wanted to do, and so I said, I'm going to try it in Rails. About the same time, I was writing a book on ASP.NET MVC, so I wanted to be able to compare and contrast the two. And by the time I was done with the second edition of the book, I was pretty much convinced that I liked Rails better than MVC. Show of hands, how many people use ASP.NET MVC? Okay. How many people here use web forms? Okay, sorry. And how many people are not web programmers? Okay, just a couple. All right. So if I say something that just doesn't make any sense at all, please stop me. But other than that, I'm going to go pretty fast. And the idea isn't just to walk you through the basic tutorial of Rails, because you can get that pretty much anywhere. I kind of want to show you the workflow that I go through and the types of things that I would do on a normal project, and hopefully we'll end up with something kind of cool at the end of this. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. First, just a few slides. So why Rails? What is so good about Rails that a bunch of people can create something from scratch without a salary that rivals some of the best funded web frameworks out there? And there's a ton of reasons why. Most people will say convention over configuration, a lot of people say Ruby. But of all of the good benefits of Rails, the reason why I stuck with it is it's fun. It makes me productive, it makes me look good as a developer, and it's just generally fun to do. The other thing that I like about Rails is the community. I still really like the Microsoft community, which is why I'm here. But it's hard not to see differences between the two. So yesterday I saw this tweet from Scott Hanselman. Entity framework code first class generation from existing databases. Yes. Does anybody think that that's a little paradoxical? This is what people are getting excited about. That I can right click and reverse engineer my database and get a bunch of classes. And somehow that's code first. I just find it so easy to pick on this type of stuff sometimes. But on the same day, minutes after I read that tweet, RailsConf is going on at the same time. And this was one of the keynote presentations. So, I mean, the community is like really, really engaged. This is like
engaged in what?
Yeah. This is 8 or 10 of the Rails core team members, and they all got up at the end of somebody's keynote and did an exercise video. It was pretty funny. Let's just talk a little bit about what's so great about Rails. I'm going to show you how to get started, and then I'm actually going to do it. So if you are on a Mac, you already have Ruby installed, which is great. If you're on Windows, you can download the Rails installer, and it will install Ruby, Ruby Gems, and Rails for you. Ruby Gems is sort of the inspiration behind NuGet, if anybody here is using NuGet yet. But basically, it's a package management system for Rails, or for Ruby. So Rails itself is a gem. So you get it by typing gem install Rails. And that gives you a command in your path called Rails. And Rails is sort of your entry point into Rails applications. So to create a new Rails application, you type Rails new and the application name. So if we were going to create an application called Clippy, we would say Rails new Clippy. And that's going to generate a bunch of stuff for us. Then at that point, we can interact with our Rails application from the command line by using the Rails command followed by any of the other sub commands that you can utilize. G is short for generate. So in this case, we can generate a resource or a model or a migration or any number of things and pass in some values, and it will generate some code for us that we can use to get started. And running the migrations, this is just the first two things you're going to do. That's why I put them up here. Ruby, almost every single Ruby project utilizes like a scripting language, kind of like Nant or MS Build, but it's called Rake. It's basically Ruby make. And so Rails itself comes with a bunch of Rake tasks that you can just invoke from the command line to perform different things. Some of them are admin-related tasks like indexing your database or creating your default admin user or any number of things. And one of those things that comes by default is to migrate your database. Okay, let's go over into the code. So, like I said before, you have a Rails command. So I'm just going to say a Rails new Clippy, and we're going to create an application. Can everybody read this? Okay, so this generated a bunch of stuff for me, and basically the reason it generated a bunch of stuff is that Rails is opinionated. It says that every application should have a good structure, and there should be one and only one place for things, and so it creates a sensible structure for you. So if you just browse around, there's an app folder, there's controllers, helpers, mailers, models, views, there's a place for configuration. Notice how it already understands about different environments, development, production, test. There's a place for documentation, database-related stuff. There's a public directory which contains some files, images, style sheets, JavaScripts. So this is kind of like your file new project in Visual Studio. If we look at that in Finder, so all of the stuff related to our app is in the app folder. We have controllers, models, and views. What pattern does that sound like? MVC. It's a widely established pattern that came across in the 70s and it just fits really well with the web. So most popular web frameworks utilize MVC as their pattern. So basically controllers are the first ones that get access to a request and they can do things with it. They're going to interact with the model, hand some model data off to a view, and the view is responsible for displaying that data. So in this case, HTML. So I'm going to go into our new application, and I'm just going to start taking a look in TextMate. So one of the things, they're giving us a base application. Is that font size big enough? Okay. Yes. Okay. We're given a base application controller, which all of our controllers will derive from. So if you need something to happen in each request, this is a decent place to put all that stuff. In this case, protect from forgery is just a security thing that comes with Rails to make sure that forms that are submitted to Rails came from a Rails-generated form, so that third parties can't just script things that go to your application. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we want to do is create our model. And our model is going to be what we're going to save to a database. So that's going to contain all the business logic. It's going to front a database table, and it's going to have columns which map to attributes. It'll have validations and all that. So what I want to build is a link sharing site, kind of like Delicious. So our first model is going to be called a link, and a link's probably going to have a title, a URL, and a description. And I can do that by looking at the Rails generators. And if I type Rails G, it'll just show me all the generators. One of those is model, right here. So if I do Rails G model, pass in some arguments, it's going to generate my model for me, and a migration to create the database table. There's another one that's built on opinions called resource. And this is the one I use most of the time, because what this is going to do is create a corresponding controller for me. It's going to add a route in the routes file, so we get nice URLs like /links or /link/5/edit, so to edit the link with ID 5, that sort of stuff. So that one comes with conventions. So I'm going to go ahead and use that one. I'm going to type Rails G resource. My resource is going to be called link. just going to give it some default attributes here. Title, which is a string, URL, which is a string, description, which is text. So that's going to generate some things for me. It created a migration here, created my model file, created some tests for me. So now I know exactly where I can go into to test this code. Created a controller, created a folder where I can put my views for the links, and created some functional tests for my links controller and any helpers that I have. So it just sort of stubs everything out for you. So now I can go into TextMate.
Hey Ben?
Yes.
So the main difference between the resource and scaffold is that it doesn't create the views?
Yeah, scaffold is kind of a slippery slope. A lot of people, in fact, when Rails was first sort of coming to popularity, one of the cool demo features was you can generate scaffolding and it's going to create all of the CRUD forms and display forms, and click here to go visit a link, click here to edit a link, you present with the form, you edit the link, save it, and it redirects back to the show page and you can click back to the list. The problem is, it's all ugly and you're going to have to customize it anyway, and I feel like wizards tend to hurt understanding. So what I'm going to do is build this from scratch piecemeal so it's easier to see what's going on. But yes, generating scaffolds will do that, but I don't know a single developer, a Rails developer who actually uses scaffold.
Right.
It's more of a demo feature. Okay, so we have our links controller. One of the assumptions that happens, I'm going to open up my routes file real quick so you can see. So it added a resources links in here for me. And that's based on convention. It's going to create a bunch of routes for me. One of them is get on links/index. Another one is get on links, link 5 link 5, get on link 5 edit, post on link 5. So there's just a bunch of routes like this, and they're all based on convention. And you really don't need to know them. You just need to know that you need to create the corresponding actions over here. So the first one is an index action. And the index action is really just to list all of the links. Okay, so I'm going to go open up my models folder and see we have a link here. The migration it created for me is called create links. So you can see that it's going to create a table here with some columns for title, URL, and description, and it automatically adds some timestamp columns for me, which is kind of helpful. So the first thing I need to do, now that I have my model, my controller, and my migration, I want to run the migration, which is rake db migrate. So one thing I didn't set up here is a connection string to a database. By default, it uses SQLite. We can take a look at that in the config directory under database.yaml. So out of the box it supports MySQL and SQLite, and there's a gem for Postgres usage. If you want to use Oracle or SQL Server, it does work, but it requires a little bit of finagling. But there's usually a gem or a plugin or something to make those work. But SQLite is perfect for development. The only time I've really had to ditch it in development is if I needed some Postgres-related features, or for one of my projects that had like 100 million rows of data.
What is pool on there?
Pool, it's like reuse 5 total connections and share them amongst other connections or something. But again, defaults that work, right? I have a local database that's that works on my machine. And you can see that I've migrated, it created a table for me. So if I were to open this SQLite file up in a SQLite manager, you would actually see a table called links. All right, so let's go ahead and start our server and see what we see. What do we see? So I type Rails S, it starts an in-process web server called WebRig. And now I'm going to go over here and go to 0.0.0.0, port 3000, and now here I am writing the Rails. Okay, so it gives me some hints on use Rails generate to create your models, set up your default route, create your database, and stuff. What I want to do is go to links, and I want to see a list of links. Okay, it handled this request because we have it in our routes file, but we never created any views for this action. So it's saying template is missing. So let's go ahead and create a template for that. So the flow is the links URL, went to the links controller, hit the index action. I didn't do anything here, but by convention it's just going to find the index view and render it. So there's no specific, I have to render this view call. So I'm going to go into views, links, and I'm going to add a new file, and this is going to be index.html.erb. There's a few different templating languages. ERB is the default and is the most common. Some people prefer HAML, and it doesn't matter, you can just mix and match, whichever is your preference. But ERB is basically Ruby mixed in with HTML. So I'm going to create some HTML here. Call it links. I'm going to say, these are my links. All right, let's see if that works. All right, so we've got a page. All right, so we definitely want there to be some links displayed here. So we're going to have some sort of a loop over some set of data, right? So we need a collection of links to display here. But this is absolutely the very wrong place to put database connection type of code, right? We don't want to put any data access here. That belongs over in our controller. So our controller, his job is to prepare things for the view. So we need a collection called links. This syntax, by the way, for Ruby means instance variable, like a field. It will be accessible by other methods in this class as well as the view. Rails is going to take all these instance methods and hand it off to the view. Okay, so we have our link class. By default, Rails uses active record, which means all of our models here have database-related stuff attached to them. So you can do, link.where, awesome is true. Right, and then it's like a mini ORM. It's going to go convert this into the appropriate SQL for whatever database I'm using. In this case, I can probably just say link.all, and just give me all of it. All right, so now back over here, I'm going to insert some Ruby code in here and say links.each do link. So this is kind of like for each link in links. And right now I'm just going to say link. So if I refresh, obviously there's no links in my database, so again, we don't see the list. But it would be kind of nice if I saw a message saying, you don't have any links yet. So let's go ahead and add an else block. What we can do is say if links.any, which is a Ruby method on array, which returns true if the count is greater than 0. So it's sort of a more English-y way of saying count greater than 0. So if there are any, then we're going to render that section. Otherwise, we're going to render this section here. All right, we don't have any links yet. So we don't have a form for creating the links yet, so it's kind of frustrating that I can't test this part up top yet. So what I'm going to do is use a feature. Open up a new tab here and go into that directory. I'm going to go into the Rails console. Now the Rails console is like IRB, which is like a Ruby interpreter. It's like a read, eval, print loop. So you can just interact with Ruby code, you hit enter, it evaluates and tells you what the result is. You can create variables, define classes, whatever. But it's all in this terminal session. Rails console does this, but in the context of your application. So I have access to all of my classes. So I have a link class, and it has all these fields. Where did these fields come from, by the way? I never defined them on my model. They were inferred by the columns in the database. Okay, so I can say link.count, which actually executes a count on the database level. Then I can say link.create. And I can pass in what's called a Ruby hash here, where the key is the column name and the value is the value. So I'm going to say my awesome blog URL is flux88.com.
Is this lambda expression equivalent to the lambda expression that we're used to in .NET? Or?
This is a hash, and the thing on the left side of the hash rocket, what's called a hash rocket, is the key, and the thing on the right is the value. So if you think about it as a dictionary with keys and values.
Okay.
The thing on the left with the colon in front of it is called a symbol in Ruby, and it's similar to a string in that there's no compile time safety here, right? There's no compiler. This is all interpreted. But symbols can exist only once. So two symbols that are the same are the exact same instance in memory. So they're very popular for use as keys or options and that sort of thing. Rails uses a whole lot of hashes and a whole lot of symbols like this. So basically, I haven't hit enter yet, but I'm about to create a link, and these are the parameters I'm passing to my link, so they'll get initialized ahead of time. Okay? It returned a link with ID 1, and because this is active record against a database, and it's using an identity fields, ID 1 means it saved already, right? It has a valid ID, meaning it actually did the database. This is the same as if I said link.new, or link.title equals Stack Overflow, link.url equals stackoverflow.com, link.save. Okay, and it returns true, telling me that the save actually happened. So now if I do link.count, there are 2 links in the database. Okay, so this is a really cool way of interacting with your model, and it is hitting my development database. So if I go back over here and refresh this, from this point on, I'm going to leave the server running unless I have to restart it. I'll go ahead and refresh this, and now I have my 2 links, and now I just need to format them. So let's do something like span class equals title. So this is the symbol, the syntax that you use to output a string inside the HTML. This HTML encodes by default. So now I can say link.title. So for example, if I created a title with angle bracket script, you know, ha ha ha, I own your box or whatever, it would just come out as literal text here. It wouldn't actually be evaluated. And then we have link URL.
Then link to what? Link about URL.
Oh yeah. Oops. Right. So obviously we want these to be links, right? So I can say link to, which is a helper. What's called a helper. I don't want to write code like this, where I have to like intermix Ruby inside of a string. It gets really cumbersome. So when things become cumbersome in a view, you want to make a helper. And Rails comes with a helper called link to. The first argument is the text. The second argument is the URL we want it to go to. So now those are links. I want these to open up in a new window. So I'm just going to pass in some options here. Target equals blank. This is setting HTML attribute. It's just by convention. It takes a hash that I put in here, and it's going to make that the HTML attribute label and value. So if I hit save on that, and then I go take a look at this link, notice that it has target equals blank here. So if you need to add HTML attributes to the link, you just pass them in as in the options hash. Right, so now if I click on that, it actually opens up in a new window. Alright, so now let's create a form for adding new links. So I'm going to do link to, new link, and what URL would I put here? Probably links new, but if I ever decided to change my URL structure, this string would have to change. So one of the things that route, let me open up the route so I can show you. One of the other things that this resources links did for me was create helpers for generating the URLs for accessing those different things. So when we go back to here, so now I can type new link path. This was defined by that method that I called in the routes file. So for all of my resources, I have like, you know, new widget path, new link path, all those sort of things. All right, so now I have a new link thing. Need some spacing here. All right, so then I click on it, and it doesn't know about this action. So now we have to create it. So we go back to our links controller, and we're going to create a new action. Link.new. All right, so what this is saying is create a new link. Don't save it yet. Store the instance variable link, and then render the view called new. So back in my views directory, in the links folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this new.html.erb. All right, so this is new link. All right, so let me just do that and make sure we got it. All right. So I want to render a form, and then I want the action of the form to go back to the create action on my controller. This is such a common thing where you have a resource, right? This is a noun in our system. You have a resource, so the destination of our form is going to be a common thing for every single resource in our system. So Rails has a helper for that. It's called form4, and I just pass in the link. All right. So the do pipe f pipe and end is basically just this is defined like this. Form4, where you take a model instance and a block of code. So that's just a Rubyism that they use. So basically, f inside of this loop is defined as a form builder for the instance of link. So what I can do with that is say f.label type, f.textfield title. Let's take a look. So now we get a title label and a text field. And notice that when I click on this gets focused. That happened because Rails inserted the ID of the title text field, because the IDs over here are generated by convention. So it knows that the ID of this guy is going to be link_title. So again, I can do the same thing and say f.label URL f.textfield URL. Alright, so now this looks ugly, so let me put in some styling. I'm also going to add the description.
Is there a way to auto-generate those fields for each variable?
Yes, I could do things like, for each column in the model, generate a label and a text field.
Okay.
The problem with that is, like, it kind of falls on its face the very instant you have something custom.
Right.
And what I was talking about before you got here was this whole scaffolding thing, where it can generate a form for you with all of your columns in it. And it does a pretty smart thing. Like, if you have a date-time field, it will give you a date-time selection box. And if you have something in the database with type of text, it will give you a text area instead of a text field. But if you don't build it, it's hard to understand it. So that's why we're building it. So here I'm going to create a text area for description. And this one I'm going to give an option called size, and I'm going to do 40 by 4. All right. Again, this looks really ugly. Let's add some CSS. So I don't want to add the CSS just in this one file. I want it to add it in all files in the system, right? So if I go into layouts, they've already created a layout for me. And they've added some stuff at the top. Well, one of them is style sheet link tag. And they say all. And what that means is they're going to look in this public JavaScript folder, public style sheets folder, and they're just going to include all the files. So all I need to do to add a style sheet is say, app.css. Put it in here. And I'll give this some styles like 18 pixel font size, font family, something like this. And I want some form styles. I want label to start on its own line. over here, we need a submit button. Right. Notice how it gave me the title create link, but I didn't type that. It just inferred it all. So if I didn't like that, I could give it a title here.
Don't swear.
Yeah. Let's just put that in my pizza. Okay, so I actually don't want it to be that retarded. So I'll take that out. Okay, so I'm just going to hit create, and what happens? It's looking for a create action. So again, these are where conventions are in place, because a new form is going to post to a create action always. You don't really have to think about it. You don't have to create a route for this. It's already created for you. And I didn't even need to tell my form that that's where it was going. I just said, give me a form for this link. It's smart enough to know that this link that I passed in from my controller has not been saved to a database yet. So the action it's going to route it to is the create action, not the update action. So let's go ahead and create our create action. So this is going to come in, and it's going to have some form parameters. In fact, let's take a look at what those are. This is the output of the Rails server, so you can always see what's going on in the logs. And let me clear it and run that one more time. Let's see. All right. So it's not going to be obvious until we actually get this running, but basically the values of the forms are going to come in a params hash, and it's going to be namespaced to the class name. So params link is going to contain a nested hash of all the values that came from the form. And remember earlier how I said link.create, and I passed in some stuff in here? Well, it just so happens that I can take the hash out of here and put it right in there. And I can do that for the new action as well. So now I can say, give me a new link, and automatically set all the values from the form post to the link instance. Then I want to save it. Remember, a link will return true or false if the save worked. So if the save worked, then I want to redirect the user to the links path. Right, back to the list. If it didn't work, then I want to re-render the form. Ideally with the same values that came from the link that they typed in before, but with some error messages. So now I can say render action is new. So what this is going to do is just re-render that same view from earlier, but the link instance that we're passing to the view this time has the values that they posted in from last time. So I'm sure we've all been to a website where you type in some stuff, you click, submit, and you had an error and it wiped out your form. That's less of a problem now than it was like early 2000, but this is one way we can do that. Okay, the other aspect of this is when we call link.save, if it came with some errors, it would populate an errors collection on link, and then we can iterate over those errors and put in nice error messages to the UI. Okay, so let's try this out. It just occurred to me that there's no way for us to have an invalid link. If I click save, it's just going to insert a bunch of empty data into the database. So let's add some logic to our model. I'm going to go to link.rb, and I want to make sure that the title and the URL are required. So there's a method on active record base called validates presence of, and you can pass in a hash of all the fields that you want to have required. Title and URL. Okay, so now if I try to save a link that don't have those, it's going to return false and populate an errors collection so we can take a look at. Alright, back to the web. I'm going to call create link, and I didn't put any error messages, but obviously there's a problem, right? I have a problem because it's rendering this again. If I put in something here and do create link, it actually added that link at the end. I don't actually want that link, so I'm going to do link last.destroy. It's gone. All right, new link. All right, so we need a way of displaying the errors that happened here. So we can go back to our new view, and I can say f dot error messages, f dot error messages. And this is where I ran into my first problem with Rails 3. For whatever reason, the Rails core team decided that this particular thing didn't belong in Rails. And like about 5 minutes after they made that decision, somebody took that functionality and made a gem out of it, and, so that you can get it back. Which brings me to one of the things that I love about Rails is I have this problem. I want to show the error messages for this, and yes, I can write the code, and it might take some trial and error to iterate over the collection and see what it returns. You know, returns an array of errors indexed by the field name, or sorry, the hash of errors indexed by the field name, and since the field can have multiple errors, the value there is an array of errors, which usually only has one value. It's a pain in the ass, and I don't want to write that because somebody else already has. So what I want to do is I want to make my application dependent on another gem. So I'm going to go over here into my gem file, and this is the one that came with Rails, and I'm just going to delete all the other crap in here so you can see what's going on. So this is my gem source. It's going to look for gems on rubygems.org. It's using Rails version 306 and SQLite gem. So I can just add something in here called dynamic form, which, by the way, was like the top 15 links I found when I was like, you know, get my old validation messages back in Rails 3 were all pointing to this guy. Okay, so now back over here, I'm going to exit out of here and I'm going to type bundle install. Now bundle install, if I didn't already have it on my system, it would have taken a while to install, but you can see somewhere in here should be dynamic form, right here. So version 1.1.4. So now that I've pulled it in and it's in my gem file, now my application has access to it. In fact, they've hooked into the form builder object to define this method again. So now, let's see, I need to restart my server because I've changed some gems. The whole gem initialization process happens when you boot up your server. So when you change things like routes or gems, you usually have to restart your server. Okay, so let's do that. We create a link, and now we get some error messages that come back. Now this doesn't look so great. I'd like this title to be sort of red so we can see what thing is wrong. So if I take a look, Rails was smart enough to wrap these things in a class called field with errors. So now I can style it differently. So if I go back over to my app.css, right there, I'll do field with errors label, and I want this guy to be bold and red. Alright, so now our URL tells me URL can't be blank. Now again, this gem I just added allows me to put the error message directly next to the field if I want, and I can also style this top thing, but for our purposes it's good enough. Another thing I would like to take a look at is, where is it? Yes, that's it. Okay. So I want a valid URL. I don't want a bogus URL format. So what you can use is validates format of and pass in a regular expression. So it's good for email and that sort of thing. And I was looking at one earlier and I found one from Google, and it just sort of. Alright, so validates format of URL with this big crazy irregular expression that I don't care to understand. So now if I refresh, the URL is also invalid. So if I get rid of the aspect of it not being there, it also has to be in a good format. So awesome URL.com. gonna make this one fail one more time. The other thing I like is having an error message sort of pop up to the user. Just sort of some notification area. And I only want that to be visible for one page load, like to indicate to the user that something just happened, right? This is actually really apparent. If I hit this and I hit create link, you're just sort of redirected back to this page and you don't really know what the hell happened, right? I want it to say, something happened here. So Rails has a concept of this called Flash. Not the Flash you're thinking of. Flash notice equals your link was created. And then in this case, Flash error. Something bad happened. Alright. So now let's go back to new link and I hit create link. Now I have access to a Flash hash in here, but I haven't rendered it yet. So let's go into I want this on every single page. So let's take a look at our application.html.erb. Somewhere up here, I actually forgot to put a title of our site here. And then just below that, I'm going to say flash.each with each pair, I think is what it is. So there's key and value. So there's just a Rubyism. Flash is a hash, so if I do each pair, it's going to iterate over both of them at the time, give me the key and the value. And let me just output them real quick so we know what we're looking at. Key, value. Alright, so key is error, value is something bad happened. So I did have it correct. So what I want to do is have a div with a class of Flash and there it is, and my key. So this is going to be like Flash and error in there. And then inside my div, output Flash, sorry, just the value. Hopefully that made sense. So I have something bad happen, and if I take a look at it, it has two classes, Flash and error. And the reason I want that to happen is because in JavaScript, I'd like to take all things with a class of Flash and just sort of hide them after a few seconds. And then for error, I want this to be the style to show there was an error. So let's just do the style thing real quick here. So .flash maybe is let's see, width of like say 500 or 400 pixels, margin 10 pixels in auto, so it's centered, and padding 10 pixels, something like that. And then if I do .flash.error, background color is something like FE color is something like that. Right, so now we have a little notice that happens. Now this would be pretty easy in JavaScript to target this and make it disappear. I also want flash.notice to be basically the same thing here, but with nicer colors. So this is going to be EFE and 030. So now, so now it says your link was created. One thing I'm noticing though is that my links are in reverse order, and I kind of want the most recent ones to be up top. So the problem lies in links controller in this method here. This is also a problem if I have 10,000 links. I don't want them all on the same page. So let's fix these problems one at a time. The first one, I can just say link.order created at descending. So that fixes it, or my first link is here. And then the second problem is if I have too many. So what I'm going to do here is go back over to the console and I'm going to create 500 links. So let's do this. Link.create, link 1. I'm just kidding. 500.times do I link.create. Title is test link and I. And the URL is, let's see, apple.com. Alright, then I'm going to end this loop and it should sort of do a bunch of stuff. Isn't this magic here? So this is doable in C#, by the way. This is basically an extension method on int, which returns an enumerator that can take an empty block without an argument or a block with an argument. I've used the second choice so that I can take I as the value each iteration through, and then I use I in the middle part of the loop. So now if I do link.count, now I have 504, and if I load this page, it takes a little bit longer. Right? All right, so paging. Let's do some paging. Paging is best done through a gem called will paginate, which is kind of a handy name. All right, so let's add that. Will paginate, and we bundle install.
Sounds like a fake name.
Will paginate. Kind of like will paginate for food or something. All right. So what I can do now is.
Dan?
Yes.
I have a question about the, in the else case, the create method.
The
When you
else
tell it
case?
to- Yeah, when you tell it to render action new, how come, is it actually executing the new method again?
No, that's a good distinction. And it confused me too because in MVC you would say render view new. And I think that's actually a better name here. Because you're really rendering the view. You're not executing this action again. But Rails sort of sees the views and the actions as sort of one and the same. So if I wanted to call the method here, which would be a very bad idea, I would just say new, which is a bad example, but it's not a good thing to do. This is pretty standard stuff too. If you do the scaffolding in Rails, you're going to generate something that looks a lot like this, but it's going to have a lot more in it. One of those things is there's a respond to block that takes an argument called something like format that some people do call it wants, and then I can say wants.html, wants.xml, and then I can say links.toXML. And so this way you can dual purpose your actions, and you can say, well, and I can show you this actually. I'll just type XML, and obviously I have that syntax error right here. But I'll actually get an XML template. In fact, I can just say render right in line like this, and then I'll get XML. And so this is a really cool way to do APIs. I mean, the idea is that you have a controller as sort of your interface, and that a human would want HTML, right? So Rails is actually inferring that the extension that you pass in here is what you want. So if I type JSON, well, there's no JSON document here, but that's pretty easy to add.
Wow.
Now I have JSON.
Nobody speaks of this to Zane. You
I'll
understand?
also add that you don't have 15 different JSON libraries that are all sort of in flux and like you do in .NET. Like, what is the real JSON serializer or deserializer you're supposed to use? Because there's like 12 of them. I don't know. And in fact, I never did learn that lesson. I just know that they all suck.
Hey Ben, and in order to like push that into the app, just the way as it is right now, you can already push that like as an XML into that URL, and it should just save it, right?
Yes, if I submitted, I'd have to turn off that form protection, the forgery protection. To do this, but then I could just craft some XML that represents a new guy, a new instance, and pass it in, and params link would actually contain the same stuff from the XML. It would just have to be formatted the right way. But this allows you to basically take your same controllers and provide an API for machine use with minimal work. In fact, this block here is sort of Rails 2 style. I'm pretty sure I can say respond with links, and then I can say responds to HTML. I'm reaching here, I'm really guessing if this is it. But Rails 3 cleaned it up a little bit, and I think it's something like respond formats or something like that. But basically you declare what formats you support here, and then you just say respond with this guy, and it does the right thing for you.
Huh.
But in general, I will say this, using your API, using this for an API is kind of, it's easy and it's kind of handy for small stuff. Like for example, if you have a type ahead form for cities or something, you know, and you want this particular one to return JSON, so your JavaScript autocomplete plugin can do the right thing. That's a good use of it. But if you're gonna make this an API for say iPhone apps, I really think APIs should be well thought out and probably separate from the concerns of the website. So in just about every app I've created, after being burned by this a couple times, I actually prefer doing it the other way.
It just became a RESTful service, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. REST is the main driving force behind this. Instead of having all the info in your URI, you leverage the verbs as well. So like put, post, get, delete. Let's just add our destroy action here real quick so I can show you something cool. So we need to find the link. Params, it's going to come in with an ID parameter. So like links/5. Then I can just say link.destroy. And then I can say flash notice that data gone. Redirect to links path. That look about right? So we're going to find the link, destroy it. You can delete without actually fetching it first, but destroy actually gives you some a hook for behavior reasons. Why, like if you delete the link, you might also want to like email the admin and say, hey, people are deleting links. Oh my god. Whatever. So the business logic case is why you might want to fetch the link first and then destroy it. But I could easily just say link.delete with the ID. All right. So how do we delete links? Let's go back over to our link list, and we'll add a delete button. So link to delete. By the way, a generic A tag that is going to generate a get. And if you have a get that changes state in your system, you're doing it wrong. So I'm going to show you how this is implemented in Rails. Because I want it to be a link, right? I don't want a button with a form that posts, right? So I want to link to, this is kind of confusing because my name is a link and I'm linking to it. But I'm passing in, instead of a URL, I'm passing in an instance. And Rails is smart enough to know what the URI for that instance is. And then I want to provide the method of delete. And why not confirm? Really sure? All right. Let me just add a style real quick. Hold on here. So we have dot links, dot title. Sorry, dot link, title. Probably do it so that you can actually see what these things are. All right, much better. All right, so if I hit delete, are you really sure? If I hit no, it doesn't do it. If I hit yes, it go. So this actually doesn't do a get. So notice how this data method equals delete and data dash confirm, and then Rails has some JavaScript that goes in and converts this to an actual form post with the method of delete. So the HTTP verb that is used here is delete. And then the Rails server says, oh, you have a link. Now notice the link is just, the URL is just to the link, but the verb is what you want to do with that. So if you put to that URL, that infers that you are updating data to that URL. If you post to just links, then the action is you're going to create a new link. And if you do delete on a specific link URL, then it will delete that. It will call our destroy action on the controller, like it just did. How much time do I have left?
What time is it?
7:48. So about 30 minutes or a little less?
8:15.
Okay. So I'd like to sort of go off the practice territory and do something that I was just thinking that might be a little cool here, if that's all right. Just so that we can sort of explore together and see how we solve problems. So what I want to do is, I want to make the title not required, and then I want, if I don't provide one, I want the system to go out behind the scenes and go fetch the title from the website and update that record. Okay, so you definitely don't want to do this when I click save and the web servers are trying to render a page, and then all of a sudden it makes a remote call to another server, which could potentially take a few seconds. That's a bad experience for the end user, and it's a bad use of your web server resources because you've got a blocking thread there. So what I want it to happen asynchronously. So in .NET you might be thinking, well, now I need like an MSMQ server, and I need a Windows service that monitors that and does stuff. And in Ruby, it's a lot easier. What I want to do is use a gem called delayed job. Delayed job. And we're going to do bundle install. Man, I already have all the gems on the system, so it's really fast. All right, so there's delayed job. Delayed job is a little bit more advanced than anything I've shown you so far. So I'm going to take a look at the generator. It created a delayed job generator. So I can say Rails G delayed job. What this is going to do is create a database table and a model for what's called the job. So since I did that, I need to rake the migrate. Notice it also put something in the script folder called delayed job. So now that that's there, let me restart my web server. Basically, delayed job has workers that monitor this table. When something gets in there, the worker grabs it and locks it, does the work. If an error happens, it updates the record with an error and retries later with a scaling retry delay. So it'll retry 1 second later, then 2 seconds later, then 4 seconds later, then 8 seconds later, then 16 seconds, if you get the idea, up to like 30 days. So it'll actually try these, keep trying them. What's cool is if you have a website that got updated and is down for 5 minutes, you really don't need to do anything for this to work, right? While it goes to fetch the title, if it errors out, it'll just try it again later. And these are sort of low value tasks. I mean, it's cool if they run, but if they don't, it's not mission critical. So, this is really cool. I do need a worker running though. So I'm going to open up a new tab. Go into that, and then I'm going to just use that script, delayed job start. And by the way, you can have multiple machines on delayed job, and so you can have as many of these workers running as you want. So it started a worker, and it's running, and I can tail-f log delayed job.log, I think. Sorry, log delayed job.log. All right. Everybody know what tail does? Sits there on the file, and as new lines get added to the file, you'll see them here. So I'm just going to leave that window open so we can see the activity. Okay, so now on my link model, I really don't want to validate presence of title anymore because I want it to be sort of default if it doesn't have one. And I'm going to add a before create fetch link title. And then I can pass in an if block here, which takes, let's call the lambda. And the lambda is basically a code block, which takes input, so this is the instance of the link. And so I want to basically say link.title, so blank. Does this make sense? Before create, I want to execute this method, fetch link title, but only if this lambda evaluates to true. Everybody understand that part of it? You can also do unless here, which means it'll only execute if that lambda evaluates to false. I could just as easily said return if link.title, return unless link.title.blank. Whichever one fits your style is fine by me. There's always like 100 different ways to do things in Ruby. All of them awesome. All right, so how best to do this? There's a few different ways to use delay jobs. So I'm just going to think. One way I can do it is say handle asynchronously. Fetch link title. So delay job works three ways. I can create a struct or a class that has a perform method, and delay job will just call the perform method when it loads it up. Or I can call a method, like if I have a method foo and it has, class foo, and it has a method on it called, this is just a one-liner to update all of the properties in this hash separated by commas and run an update statement. Alright, so, and we do have a worker running. So let's try this out. New link, leave the title blank. I'm going to go to google.com this time, create link. Alright, so notice it doesn't have a title. I refresh, still doesn't have a title. It's possible that didn't actually work. Let's see, this guy's not doing anything. Let's see if that job actually got added to the database. So there are no jobs created. Let me kill the worker. So what it'll do is just leave the job in the database. And if there's no job in the database, then what I've just tried to do isn't going to work. Alright, I'll delete that one. And create a new one. And we'll do delay job.count again, and we have a count here. And so I wonder what it did. Maybe it updated early. Let me just do this. And then start the worker.
Are you trying to update it before you actually save it? Before you create it?
Very possible. We should get an error somewhere in our log. Last 50 lines of log, development log. So there's the update statement. And then it just deleted it. Let's see what's going on here. I mean, I could sleep 10 seconds maybe and see if that does the trick.
But you're running the update before you do the create.
This is after. I need to do after create. You're right. All right. So now that I have an after create, let's try this. Try this out. like I said, unpracticed, fly by the seat of your pants. But a lot of times this is sort of just, you know, how you end up learning about these libraries. All right. So we got an error now, which is good. Undefined method, variable or method link, and that's this right here. So I wanted to call self, which I actually can just call update attributes, because self is applied. All right, so that thing is going to keep getting retried. So just by saving that, it's possible that that will actually still work. But just for grins, let's do it again. Check the logs. Alright, looks like we got a same problem here. Undefined local method link. Let me restart the, yeah, this is another thing. Since this guy, the delayed job loads up my Rails environment, it already has a cached copy of my data, right, of my models in my environment. So it's possible that when I updated the class, that I need to restart this, similarly when I have to restart the web server. Oh, finally it went through. So this one actually worked. This one is probably waiting. So I can take a look at, so this guy has a update. Let's see, where is run at? Run at 5:20 at this time. So that's tomorrow at 1 a.m. Right, because it failed so many times that now it's going to start waiting. So what I can do is say delay job.first.update attributes, run at 30.seconds.from now. How about that? Delay job.first.update. What's the... Actually, you're right. Looks like while I was trying to do that, somebody picked it up. Okay, so we have about 13 minutes to try and fetch remote URL with Nokogiri. Nokogiri is a pretty cool library to go, like basically scraping. It's like an HTTP client, so to speak. So let's go ahead and do this. We'll add Nokogiri to our gem file. Nokogiri. It's very likely that you have Nokogiri already because like 90,000 gems depend on this because it's just sort of one of those core gems. It also might not work so great on Windows because it has a lot of C extensions for
Now,
speed
is
reasons.
that what Cucumber uses for the web steps and stuff?
Cucumber uses like WebRat or Selenium WebKit. Those are for driving a web browser.
Right,
or
but
a
I mean,
web
when
client,
you
right?
do something like then I should see.
Yes, I
Right,
do
so-
believe it uses Nokogiri.
So yeah, so that should work fine because I see that
You
when
see all
I'm
that
building stuff. Yeah.
There may be some fallback stuff where or it just does work because libxml2, I don't know if that's available on Windows, but I think there's some sort of fallback mechanism for Nokogiri if that's not available.
Okay.
Alright, bundle, install. Alright, so in our link, and I'm sort of, like, I don't really like putting this in the link model because I think the link actually going to fetch a website and our stuff is probably outside the scope of this class. But I'm just going to do it here for the sake of brevity. I would probably prefer creating a new class, not a Rails model, just a class that would stuff in the lib folder here called link title fetcher. And then in here I would just say go fetch title, right?
Do you actually get the title back from that, or can you only say updated asynchronously?
That's what I'm about to do right now.
Okay.
So instead of the sleep 10 business, I'm going to say sure if I have to, well, let's just see if this works. I think I have to include open URI, now that I think about it. Open URI. So, I'm going to get an HTML document from Nokogiri, and that has that takes a URI stream. So I use open URI to just open the website. So I want to open the URL here, and then I can say doc dot. Let me look up syntax real quick. Nokogiri. So there's XPath or CSS, depending on which one you want to do. Let's use the CSS one. So I just want the title, and then I want the first one, .text. So I can say self.title equals that. And what I can do to make this a little bit easier to debug is comment this out, so it'll actually run in process when I hit save. And then once we have it working, I would just take that out. All right. Let's go back over here, run our server. Oops. Let's go get a new link. And let's try my blog. And I went and fetched the URL.
Very cool.
Okay, so now I want to do this asynchronous.
Does it matter where in the file you have that handle asynchronous?
It's got to be after the method was defined. Because the way that, so one of the things you're seeing here, and it's not obvious because, you know, I've been in your situation staring at Ruby code and you're like, well, there's just sort of these magic keywords that do interesting things, like this, for example. These are actually methods, and you're calling methods while you're defining a class. So like as it's parsing this thing, it's like, all right, I have a link class, and it validates presence of URL. And so that's actually a method call that takes a parameter, where we're passing in the symbol URL to that method. And so the person who defined this, let's just define, it's going to look something like this. Active record base. This is like a namespace, by the way. And then they have a method, which is a static method, self.validates presence of options. And then they're going to do something with this. Probably add it to like a validations array. So like validations is going to be nil assigned to an array, which means only make it this if it wasn't nil. And then I can say validations, you know, validation.new options, something like that. I have no idea if this is what it actually looks like, but this is a way that I could say people who inherit from me can call this method, and I can stuff their options in an array and do something with them later. That's kind of how that's implemented. Same thing with the handle asynchronously thing. Handle async. Let's just call it async. And this is going to be like a method name. And then I can do things like alias method chain, and then pass in the method name and the awesome wrapped method. Which the awesome wrapped method now has the new functionality, and so this is basically saying when I come across the method that you pass in, I'm gonna take that aside and rename it to something else. I'm gonna wrap that method in some calls. So this is like a really, really lightweight way of doing aspect-oriented programming. And it's done all the way up to the Rails core, which is pretty cool. It allows you to do some interesting things in very few lines of code. And it's kind of hard to understand at first, but you know, once you understand it, it makes sense. That's probably the dumbest thing I've said all night. Once you understand, of course it makes sense. But, I don't know, there's some interesting things in Ruby, I'll just leave it at that. What else can we talk about for the next 5 minutes? So let's do this.
Well, how big's, okay, so you've been doing Ruby, how big is the Ruby community out there?
Not as big as Microsoft Community, I'll say
Well,
that, but the average Ruby programmer is pretty smart.
The company you're at, is there, is that what you
Yeah,
guys mainly do? Do you
Yep.
do anything non-Ruby?
we do iPhone apps. But-
Okay.
For web stuff, not really. There's some like WordPress type stuff, so there are people who sort of tinker around with PHP to hack around a CMS, but for real applications, we use Ruby.
And the people, where did Ruby come from?
The language?
Yeah, who's supporting it?
It's open source.
It's okay.
So it's invented by Matsumoto, I don't remember his last name. Anyway, this guy, everybody calls him Mats for short. He's Japanese, and so there's half of the Rails core team Ruby core team is Japanese, and there's a bunch of people in the States who contribute to it as well. It's fairly active. Yeah, I don't know, it's just an interesting mix of just people who are passionate about open source and language, and this is sort of, there's a lot of things you can do with Ruby that you could kind of do with Python, but there's a big philosophical difference between the two. Python is very much, there's one and only one good way to do something. It's the Python way, whereas Ruby, there's a million ways to do something, and it's whatever's most elegant or most relevant to the problem at hand. So there's a lot of flexibility to create domain-specific languages in Ruby with pretty minimal effort, so that you can really get rid of a lot of the fluff and cruft that comes with like class-oriented programming, like semicolons and parentheses and stuff that in certain situations can be a hindrance in readability, right? And so it's kind of nice. Have you guys seen RSpec before?
Yeah.
So built in, since I didn't change anything in here, built in the tests that come are test unit. So if you take a look at a link test, right? It has stuff like this. I could say test link should have a URL or something. So, this is not a method definition, right? This is something new that you haven't seen yet. You could probably guess what this is, right? What is this? If you were implementing something where you wanted your clients or your consumers to type this and something happens, what would this be? It would probably be a method call, right? It would be a method call defined on this guy. So I would do something like test, description is the first parameter, and a block is the second parameter. So this do end stuff is actually like a lambda that gets passed in as a variable to that block. And then later on, I don't have to run it right now. I can say block.call. Again, these are just interesting Ruby things, but like the core of RSpec, RSpec is actually better than this because there's no classes involved. It's just describes, context, given, when, then type of stuff. And so you're starting to get away from the constructs and confines of classes and methods, and instead doing like context and shared groupings based on like common setup, like a customer with a delinquent account, right? The fact that you have to wrap that in a method that inherits from test case is kind of BS in my opinion. So what I would do for that, in my applications, just go to the gem file here and pull in an RSpec. And then Rails G RSpec install. So remember how we said earlier, gems can add their own generators. So RSpec adds a generator in there, which creates a folder called RSpec. And now that I have a spec folder in here, let's just go ahead and create a test. I'm going to call this link spec. It's got to be RB. Alright, So the only thing I'm really required to do is say require spec helper at the top. After that, I can say describe link and then I can say it should take a URL and a title. Link.create title is foo URL equals that should be true. Alright, so this is RSpec, right? They've done a lot to, like, what is this business? Just that one line. It's converting that language, this domain specific language of asserts. In test unit, you would do assert equal or assert true, right? Assert equal this. I much prefer this. It's less programmery, right? It's, what are you doing? You're specifying behavior. The link, the result of the creation should be true. So if I want to run that, I just run RSpec.
You can also write it like should be true, right?
Yep. Depends on whatever's more readable to you.
Right.
You can do things like it should include awesomeness. And then you could say, awesome, cool, rad, that should include awesome. Right, and so the RSpecs, I mean, the Ruby is malleable enough where you can make this type of stuff work. I actually had a failure here. Oh yeah, sorry. The result should be a link. Sorry, it shouldn't actually equal true. I should say link equals link.new. Link.save.should be true. How about that? And then I also have the second one, should include awesome. Okay, 2 examples, 0 failures. So I think that the barrier to testing is way lower here than on any other platform I've been on. In .NET, I was always fighting to get people to test and trying to get people to write unit tests. And in general, most of the teams I was on, I was the only one writing unit tests. I was also the only one running the unit test. And they did provide value to me, but I'm finding more and more that if somebody's not testing, it's not too much for me to ask them to write something this simple, right? You don't need to ask management to do something this simple. And so for me, this really enables you to do TDD and not get caught in the, in general, you don't have to ask permission. I'll just say that. I've been on teams in the past in .NET projects, larger projects, where people see a third-party DLL and they kind of freak out. The whole Rails culture is based on open source and, your gem file. In fact, I will show you my gem file from a real project. Right. There's just a ton of stuff in here. GeoKit, this stuff does geocoding for mapping. I can give it an address and it'll tell me what Google thinks about that address, where it is, and what the actual format of this address structure is. SAS for better CSS structure, where you can actually nest CSS rules. RMagic for image resizing and thumbnailing. Active Merchant for credit card processing. There's well paginated you saw earlier. There's delayed job. Oops. There's delayed job. Here's our friend Nokogiri. I mean, it's just a lot of these things are common, and you're like, oh yeah, I used a gem like that. I needed to generate PDFs before. So you know what I did? I said, how do you generate PDFs in Rails? And there was like 100 different ways you could do it. I would say the best way to learn is to go to Railscasts. Ryan Bates runs this site, and every week he comes up with a new 10 to 15 minute screencast about all this stuff. When I was starting out, I basically went to his backlog. I don't know if he shows them all on here. I guess not.
There is a link someplace for all.
Well, he used to do it.
Oh yeah, it looks different.
Yeah, he totally changed it.
Yeah.
So, simple form. I'm just going to take a look at this. And some awesome guy decided to transcribe every one of his Railscasts, so a few weeks lead time. And this guy creates ASCII cast, which is basically a text version of it with screenshots. So after I've watched one of these things, I will come back to ASCII casts and refer to it later. And
What kind of life do these people have?
Well, you asked about community, right? That's community right
Yeah.
there.
You were asking earlier about how to simplify the whole form thing.
Yep.
This guy created a gem called Simple Form, and it's a little bit simpler, right? And it's based on conventions.
Cool.
So I'm a little bit over. Hopefully I showed you a little bit of why I like Rails and why I think it's really powerful. Any other questions about what I went through? Or?
Okay, I'm still a little confused. Okay, so Ruby is the language?
Yes.
And Rails is the interface?
Rails is the web stack.
Okay,
So,
It's the ASP.NET
yeah.
part,
okay.
or the MVC equivalent, ASP.NET.
Yeah, so the history is Ruby has been around since the 70s, but never was widely adopted. And a lot of small talkers were sort of the pioneers of the agile software movement and really liked this sort of dynamic messaging structure of small talk. I never did small talk, so I really don't know what I'm talking about here, but I know that the community around small talk was closely knit, and if you look at the Agile Manifesto, a vast majority of the people on that list who signed the original one were small talkers. A lot of those people moved to Java because Smalltalk was sort of a fenced-in, closed, proprietary platform. A lot of those people moved to Java, and eventually Ruby became sort of more popular, and a lot of those people are now on Ruby. I mean, you look at the list, and almost all of them at least spend some part of their day in Ruby. David Hannemeyer Hansen was doing PHP in I think 03 or so, consulting, and hated it, with good reason. And looked around and was like, I hate everything out there. The guy's pretty animated, so if you've never seen him
Who's
talk.
this guy, David?
David Hannemeyer Hansen.
Yeah, I never heard.
Yeah, he's a creator of Rails. He's famous for, dropping the F-bomb at large conferences, and he's an interesting individual, and he's super opinionated. Originally, he was like, I wrote Rails for me, and if you don't like it, then screw you, right? And the whole reason behind it is Rails doesn't need to be enterprising, right? You don't need to satisfy everybody. A lot of the web frameworks of the day were Java related, and Java sort of configure everything. All you got to do is open this 2,000 line XML file and tweak it. And so this ultimate configurability ends up costing you because there's just so much mental weight around it. Whereas Rails came to the scene and he said, I like Ruby. I think I could write a web stack in that using MVC, which is a well-known pattern. And the early versions of Rails were kind of weird looking, but it was open source and people were fine with it. So, I was telling Claudio earlier this week to just search Twitter for RailsConf, which happened this week. Look at the keynote presentations from RailsConf. They're on YouTube. It's just a really vibrant community of passionate people. And a lot of the new ideas for the web are coming out of the Rails camp. People get excited about it and they're able to use it today. And then 3 or 4 years down the line, somebody will incorporate that into web forms or MVC. And this is sort of the nature of the business. The things I'm excited about coming into Rails 3.1 are CoffeeScript and Sass. CoffeeScript is a abstraction on top of JavaScript. It looks kind of like Smalltalk. It's kind of, it's weird to look at, but when you look at it, it feels kind of like Ruby as well. And so the creator of JavaScript actually says he almost prefers it to JavaScript. And in the end, it compiles down, or it, you can, what do you call it, generate JavaScript based off of it, and it's completely valid. And so that's going to be built into Rails 3.1 coming out in the next month or two. So, you know,
How
that's
do you feel
exciting
about
to me.
using TextMate for everything versus a real ID? What was that?
Well, what do you get from a real ID besides like slow loading time?
I mean,
crashes
seriously,
a lot.
you know, when I was trying to first get into Rails, you know, that's some, I think with Visual Studio, it has helped you. When you start with something new, you know, code completion, you know, it does help you learn things.
You can use Ruby
Going to
Mine.
TextMate, it was, even with the
Yeah.
bundles, it's like, you don't know until you run it if you have a typo or you have you completely screwed up the syntax or anything like that. That was really
That's true.
frustrating.
The feedback loop is a lot faster though. There's no compile step, and you have IRB. I mean, seriously, go into an Apple store. Rails is already on the system, right? Open up a terminal, and you already have Ruby, right? I can type IRB, and I can just start typing. I can say, you know, 5 dot times what's high, or I can say high times 7. I mean, you can practice this. There's a try Ruby in your browser. I can't remember what the thing is, but if you Google it, you'll find it. And it's a web-based
Tryruby.org.
tryruby.org. Yeah. Go to that and just tinker with it. I think that I don't need an IDE because, in general, IDEs have way more functionality than I really care about. Like, for example, when I was doing .NET full-time, particularly web forms, I would never, ever, ever use the designer because it did horrible things. Now, granted, it let VB6 smart client developers have a natural transition path to the web, but you know, the designer is one thing that I just absolutely hated. The toolbars, like copy paste on the toolbar, like I have a keyboard right in front of me. Like I always like minimize all that stuff, got rid of all the toolbars, and so I was kind of a minimalist anyway. And I found that just terminal and TextMate is all I really needed. Granted, there are times when I wish I could set a breakpoint debug, and you can do that, though I never have in Ruby. I think write some tests, prove small bits of functionality work, and just piece it together as you go. And the feedback loop there is pretty darn quick.
And do you have problems? It seemed like when I was messing with it and I had projects written at night, if I upgraded a gem or I upgraded my version of Rails, everything broke. And
Yeah.
It seemed like there was very
How long ago was this?
compatibility from version to version, and that just, you know, it stopped me in my tracks and it made me want to do other things.
What time frame was this?
It was still, it was before 3.0 came out. It was, I don't,
Yeah, so
a year or two.
that's pre-bundler. So what Jason's describing is, I'm sitting at the terminal and I type gem install will paginate, right? If I can type. And that goes and fetches the gem and puts it on my system. And then in Rails, somehow I say I need that gem, right? So it's more just a pointer and say, hey, require this for me so that I can use it in my application. Problem is will paginate depends on active record, which is part of Rails. So if active record gets a version update and it breaks will paginate, we have to wait for will paginate to come up with that update. So you have a couple of options. You can